to the Change Your Mind podcast. I'm your host, Chris Ashley. We are going to have a really interesting conversation today. I have with me a therapist who works specifically with gamers and fandom people. And it's all about the narratives, the stories we tell ourselves. And I'm really excited to get into this conversation. First, a couple quick announcements, though. Head over to the links in my show notes. You'll find a link to my book, Change Your Mind to Change Your Reality. You'll find links to my free masterclass, free downloads, courses, coaching, ways to stay connected. Please come be a part of the community, help spread the good word. All right, so with me today, I have Ben Stimpson, I'm sorry. Ben Stimpson is a therapist, lecturer, student, and spiritual director. Ben has developed courses on a variety of topics, including ancestor veneration, the power of story, and folklore. When not working with clients or writing, Ben is engaged with his areas of study: religious studies, medieval and classical studies, folklore, and spirituality. Awesome. Welcome, Ben. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you. I've been really looking forward to sitting down with you since we had our chat a few weeks ago, I should say. So I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. And I'm really excited to get into all these topics. But I always start my shows the same way. And that is by asking my guests, what is your origin story? And I think that term origin story works so well for you, right? What led you on this path? What made you want to work with people in this specific genre?
Absolutely. So it's a very long, winding story. I talk a lot about it on my own podcast. But in brief, I live in Ontario, Canada. You can tell by my accent I'm not originally from Ontario, Canada, though. So I'm originally from the United Kingdom. I came over when I was about 8.5, and one of the biggest issues that I had was culture shock. I was suddenly different. I was suddenly foreign. I was suddenly British, which I wasn't when I was in the UK. So a lot of people understand when I say it that way. So what I really was looking for in my life was a way of connecting. And one of those routes was to study originally social work. And that didn't really work for me. And so in 2010, I dropped out of university and kind of floundered about trying to figure myself out for a few years until eventually I got back on the right track. And that right track was studying, originally going and doing a self-help class myself, and then eventually psychotherapy. And concurrently to that psychotherapy work, I was involved with spirituality. And one of the groups I fell in with worked with the power of story, the power of play, and Joseph Campbell's hero cycle, for example, right? So that really kind of propelled me forward, and eventually I fell into working with narrative therapies. So I'm kind of all over the place, but it's really pointing me towards that idea of story and narrative. And one of the big things in my life that I used as an escape for myself was fantasy and science fiction. And so I've noticed a lot of people in my queer community, a lot of people of my generation, our generation, I would say, really found themselves through fantasy and storytelling. And so now I use it in my therapy work with people.
Thank you for sharing. And I just think it's so fascinating. And I was just saying to you before we recorded, it makes sense because we all tell ourselves stories, right? That's so much of what can either propel us forward or hold us back, right? These stories that we tell ourselves. But when you're talking about it, you're talking about like fantasy stories that people are engaging with. So talk to me a little bit about how that intersects with the therapy you're doing with people, how people are using these stories.
Absolutely. So I'll start off by saying, and really picking up on what you said, human beings are story driven. We like our basic biochemistry, our basic psychology, and this is cross-culturally, we really relate with story because story is relatable. Within story, we can access emotions and access like kind of thoughts and feelings in a way that factual information we just can't get to.
Totally.
So particularly with literature, for example, and there's a whole stream of therapy called bibliotherapy, which is using stories and literature as a kind of an entry point to ourselves. We often will see externally what is really internally. And through that, people like people. If I ask people, what is your favorite character when you were a kid? Oftentimes, people will relate to or say the character that they really relate to. A lot of people in my circle when I was growing up, um, Elizabeth Bennet, for example, is a feminist icon, or a superhero character, or whatever it happened to be. Peter Pan, Harry Potter tended to be one I really connected with.
I wasn't going to say it this time.
Yeah, right. But there's something about the story, we follow along with those stories. So I've noticed that people of my generation, I'd say probably between the ages of 25 to 40, and even going up to 50, fantasy and science fiction tended to be a place that they saw themselves in and experienced, because those were really the big genres, right? If you ask people of a certain generation, if they saw Star Wars, and yeah, of course, I remember seeing Star Wars, or I remember seeing whatever it is, Star Trek, for example, right? And it's that way of that connecting with story and thus connecting with self. It becomes what a particular anthropologist named T.L. Luhrmann says is a paracosm. It becomes an external world that people can enter into. And through that process, they can explore themselves. So, for example, the Neverending Story, right? An entire world completely created through the imagination of one person who was reading. And everything in that story is symbolic of the internal world of the reader, right? So when I started to piece those pieces together, particularly through my own spiritual path, I started to realize that this is kind of baseline psychology. This is what Carl Jung, this is what Freud would have been talking about. It's dream world, right? It's very similar to dream dynamics, right? Whereas people would be looking at dreams and thinking, well, what messages is this dream sending me? We utilize story and fantasy and sci-fi in that particular way, and fantasy and sci-fi in particular because it's very relevant. Video game culture is a big part of popular culture now. Maybe 30 years ago, people have been seen as dweebs or nerds or ostracized for that. But nowadays, it's really become a space that people can go and they can escape to, but they escape to something that really brings them back to self. So when I'm working with clients, we'll often work with the characters that they connect with. What is it about these characters that they love? What is it about these stories that they love? What is it that they relate to? And then we bring and we put the mirror up and we reflect back. Another big aspect is like live action role play. That's a huge one right now too, amongst certain populations, certain generations. And it's all the very similar work that people are doing.
It's so fascinating. Thank you for explaining all that. And I like that you said the word mirror, because I wrote that down in my notes. It's like they're especially when you're like, what's your favorite childhood character? That makes so much sense, because of course that person is a mirror for either what you're already feeling or maybe like what you want to be, right? What you're like striving to be. So it's not so much that people are using a story to escape, they're almost using it as a way to access their own emotions that maybe they're having trouble relating to in this reality, right? It's like a way inward through this third party. It's really fascinating. And I like that you brought up video games. I was telling you right before,
Yeah.
my husband is the president of a video game company. And when I first met him, I was like, oh, video games, whatever. But he told me that the video game industry is bigger than the music and movie industry combined. And that blew my mind.
Oh yeah, I
It's
know.
crazy. It's so many people are really into video games. Um,
It's really become, again, a huge part of popular culture because it's much more versatile than music or through the movie industry, right?
yeah.
There's a certain element of interaction that music and television can't give you. This is why immersive experiences are so popular, right? People can really get into the story and become and live out a life through that story. And I love that you raised the idea of escapism. I think originally for a lot of people it can be escapism, but then it quickly turns into again what T.L. Luhrmann says is a paracosm. It's that external virtual space that people can live through. This is why Sims is so big. This is why Skyrim and any of those RPGs are really big, right? And I think that going forward, what the industry is understanding is that there is a certain psychology to video games, and this is becoming a big part of why and what's driving certain types of experiences. I think this is why virtual, what do you call it, the virtual
VR
reality,
headsets and stuff. Yeah.
yeah, the headsets, they're going to be really big in the future because of that. Right?
I mean, it makes sense because when you're watching a movie, you're just passively sitting there watching a movie. But when you're actually playing a game, it's like watching a movie that you create, right? Like you create your own adventure. So talk to me a little bit more about what you just brought up, that video games can be this therapeutic tool that people are seeing.
Absolutely. So there's multiple ways of doing it, and so I was just saying to you before we started recording, there is actually a full conference, and I suspect there's probably other conferences going on that are exploring this. And again, it's that looking at video games not only as escapism, not only as like addiction, which they can become, but more as a space similar to any other type of space that we encounter in life, right? So it becomes a how is the person relating to that space? How are they relating to characters? How is that experiencing affecting them? And that's a very similar then process to people who are live action role playing, who are playing video games, who are reading fantasy material and then engaging with it in kind of fan fiction writing, which is another big piece of what I do with my clients, right? It's how are they engaging with these characters and what impact is it having on them? So a typical example of that would be with live action role playing, which is a very similar form of immersive experience as video games, especially single player RPGs. It's how are they relating to that character? What are they expressing through that character? And particularly with games where they get to choose what they look like, right? So a lot of my clients tend to be people of the queer community, and members of that community are often using video games and kind of virtual experiences as a way of self-expression, right?
Mm.
And I think that's true for many people, right? If I were to ask you, if you were to come up with a video game character, what would they look like?
I don't know. I've never thought about that before. But when you asked me or when you were saying who's your favorite character, mine was always Belle from Beauty and the Beast because I just
Elf,
related to her so hard. Like the reading nerd, like didn't really have friends, felt out of place. Like that was what I related to immediately. But I don't know. I don't know what my video game character would look like. I don't
it's an
know.
interesting question, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I find that oftentimes that question can become like a very old therapeutic technique is to do like a self-portrait, right? Create a self-portrait of yourself, and then we'll talk about how you see yourself. Well, a lot of people have caught on to that, and they don't like that because it's like, oh, don't therapize me, right? But if you ask, if you're creating a video game character, what would you make it look like? Well, that's a way of kind of wheedling in, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And no, I love it. I love how it can be self-expression. I love how it can be this way to just feel more yourself and try to figure out your own identity. Like it makes a lot of sense. So, like how do these stories that people are creating interweave with the stories that, society is telling us and their own lived family stories? Like talk to me about the intersection between all of that.
Absolutely. This is where the other part of my work comes in, which is ancestral story. So, um, one of the major kind of traditions that I was trained in was family systems theory. And that's the
Say it
idea
again. It was what?
family systems theory.
Family systems. Okay.
So it's the idea that we are all born into contexts that have been created by society. Our families are aspects of culture that we're born into, and then we're taught how to be based on those family traditions. And it's so subliminal, it's so subconscious that everybody deals with this, even to the end of their lives, right? We're constantly learning about the impact of how we were taught to be in society. Now, some family systems are healthy, a lot of family systems are unhealthy or have aspects of unhealthiness to them, right? And so, because of those stories and those self narratives that we develop, we operate through life oftentimes through that subliminal lens. We aren't fully consciously aware of that self-consciousness of how we've been taught to be in society. Now, that being said, how kind of, again, fantasy and how literature and how other narratives come in is that oftentimes we are subconsciously aware of aspects of ourselves. Sometimes we recognize them, and oftentimes we recognize them in others. I'll give you an example of this, right? If you're annoyed by somebody and you don't know why, oftentimes that's because they're reminding you of something that you're really not liking in yourself, right?
Yeah, I love that.
Right?
Yeah.
And subconsciously, we are very aware of that, but it manifests through as emotion, right? So what we're looking then is with like cognitive behavioral therapy is to trace back and look at the beliefs then and that narrative that those feelings are generated by. The same thing is in with literature. The same thing is with, even historical persons, right? Look at our heroes and look at our villains. And what is it about those people, their stories that we really connect with? And this is really where the ancestral piece comes in. Is oftentimes with ancestral work, we're working with the story that we've been handed in the family. Oftentimes, that story is actually a narrative that is there to protect us from truth. If you look at, say, black sheep of your family who are really just going and living their own life, um, oftentimes the family is trying to protect itself, right? And that's again a very subconscious kind of hive mind approach. So when people are able to dive in to themselves, often through that lens of looking externally, they can start to separate themselves from the family narrative and make better choices to what they want in their lives. Now, there are multiple ways of doing this, right? As I said, we're a really story narrative driven biological organism, right? So that could be through fantasy, it could be through, particular family members or ancestors that we really resonate with. What is the biggest thing that Ancestry.com says in their tagline? Find out who you are or find out your family story. Oftentimes, we really connect with ancestors whose story really just inspires us. And we have that connection because they're biologically connected to us. So it's an interesting way of looking at self as being both kind of individual, but also really interconnected and sometimes go to codependent with other forms of story. That's where it becomes an unhealthy piece, is when it becomes a codependent piece.
Right. Yeah. Or if crosses over that into that addiction. So the video game and fandom characters are almost a way to break away from this maybe unhealthy family story that we have, right? Probably unconsciously.
Totally.
So,
Yeah.
so you mentioned heroes and villains, and I think that's really interesting. First of all, like, why do we need heroes and villains? And then
Mhm.
I guess second part of that question is, do people always need to see themselves as the hero? And I'll give you a little context. I was talking to another therapist who was telling me, people always in their own stories, always make themselves out to be right, right? Like everyone else was at fault for this. They were the ones that hurt me. This was unfairly done. They come up with reasons why they're the hero of the story. So I'm really curious your take on that.
Absolutely. We aren't hearing the full conversation. I definitely understand where that person is coming from based on what I've heard. Oftentimes people can get into, especially people who are in a place of insecurity, in a place of defensiveness, in a place where perhaps of abuse, that victim subpersonality can come up as a way of protecting. So that's
Mhm.
another part of kind of the family systems theory that I work within. There's this really wonderful system called internal family systems, which is looking at parts of self as ways of that have been generated within self to defend us and to protect us from outside harm. So how these develop? I think everybody, if really pressed, can identify times when they've been in a group or they've been in a situation where afterwards they come out of it and they're like, that wasn't me. I don't know why I was like a raging bitch in that, or I don't know why I was so funny in that. Like, I'm not a funny like extrovert. What was that, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Right? And what happens is we develop these parts or these subpersonalities to protect ourselves in certain situations. And they are parts of us. They're not multiple personalities. They're parts of us. They're just ways that we cope within certain, they're masks that we put on, often subconsciously in certain situations, to feel comfortable in those situations, right? So I think that when it comes to characters, it's a very similar process. We resonate with certain characters in a way that is going to serve us, and oftentimes that need to be the hero of our story is really important. People often don't like to think that they can be the villains in somebody else's story, but oftentimes other people, because they need to have a villain in their story because of their personal narrative, will make you the villain. And this is where people get caught, because oftentimes they feel that they have to take on the responsibility of being that villain when they don't, because that villain isn't who they are.
I love what you just said. And I'm just thinking of like a personal instance where there was a group of people who made me out to be a villain. It was a very traumatic experience. It was this community I was a part of, but there was this like knee-jerk reaction in me that was like, well, maybe if all these people say I'm this bad person, I just need to be this bad person.
Mm.
And it was like this weird coping thing. And then like eventually I came around and I was like, it took a while, but I was like, no, I know I'm not that person. I know like who they see is not me, and that things got twisted. But it's interesting that you said that, because that was like this like it was almost this like it came from this like depressed place, right? Like and probably a little bit of victimization there too. But no, it's just really fascinating because that was the knee-jerk reaction.
And it's a knee-jerk reaction because we're social creatures, right? This is how socialization, this is why family cultures exist, is that we don't do well when we're alone, right? There are certain people, like that old woman in Russia who's been living there for like 50 years in the wilderness with ravens. Like, those people are great, but the majority of human beings, we don't do well when we're isolated because we're social pack creatures, right?
Right.
And I think that that understanding of our basic universal psychology, that we're social creatures, we will often do things that are out of character for ourselves in order to feel like we belong. Because the stress, the internal subconscious stress of not belonging in a situation, causes us a lot of other issues, right? So
Mhm.
oftentimes when a group, especially if a group is viewed as powerful, or if a group is viewed as being something we want to belong to, if they're telling us you are this person, that you need to be this person in order to belong or to even be recognized, then we'll become that person, right? I think where it becomes dangerous is, again, that idea of accepting very unhealthy dynamics, and engaging in really unhealthy dynamics. This is the reason why cults and gangs and other groups, political parties even, the way that those groups operate, the Stockholm syndrome is another example of that, right? Very classic example of that, right?
Oh.
And then it becomes a question of, well, whose narrative are we taking on? Right?
Yeah, and I'm almost thinking about like the cult leaders themselves, right? If all these people are putting you on this pedestal, like of course and celebrities, right? It goes like yeah, no, it's so fascinating to think about. And it also makes me think about like, if you have an old group of friends from like high school or something, it's like when you're back together, you kind of fall into your old roles,
It's true.
right? Without even like meaning to.
It's true.
It's
Yeah.
super
Well,
interesting.
and I mean, let's look at the circumstance of us recording. I mean, it's what, the December 22nd, right? You've had a lot of people who've just been with their family for Hanukkah. You have a lot of people who are going to be celebrating Christmas or Yule coming up this weekend, right? How many people go back to their base families and suddenly they're all teenagers again, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And it causes stress. My week next week is filled with clients who are going to be coming and like talking about their family with me.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's probably the busiest time of year for a therapist. It's so true though. My mother and I had that dynamic for a long time. It was like we would revert to when I was 12. She would treat me like I was 12 and I would act like I was 12, and it took a lot of work to be like, wait, we're both adults now. No, it's super I mean, everything you're saying, I'm like, yes, yes, I know that.
Mm.
Okay, so you mentioned something interesting when you were talking about all these parts of ourselves. You were talking about how they're masks that we put on. Do we ever take every single mask off? Because there's also this idea that like you are different in everyone's eyes, every single person's eyes, and different than like how you perceive yourself. So I just love your thoughts on that.
Oh, I think you need to bring a Buddhist on to talk about
Well,
that, because that's really the essence of Buddhism. That idea of like, who are we underneath all of those masks? The important thing with this is that all of those masks are generated by us. They are parts of us, right? And so like it's that idea of integration of authenticity, and I feel that that is actually part of the natural aging process. Eventually, we just get to a point where we've experienced all of these various masks. We've experienced all of these things, and so we just get to a sense of kind of like a baseline, right? It's not like a peaks and valleys. It's we've just come to that kind of middle place, right? Um, I feel like people can often get really highly attached to defining it and identifying themselves through things like what they do, who they're with, right? What their current thing and fixation is,
yeah.
right? And that whole point of identity is who are you? Right? Who are you outside of your family? Who are you outside of your workplace? Who are you, or who are us outside of podcasting? Right? And if people only relate to us through particular facets of who we are, then in those moments, we only become those people to them, and vice versa, right? So it's becoming then stepping forward and finding the interrelations between all of those pieces, right?
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely makes sense because people are gonna see you in different places in the world, like you said, like you might be part of this group and that group and your family and that totally makes sense. I like that answer a lot. I like how you said, as we get older, there's more authenticity. It just makes me think like old people like just get to that point where they don't give a shit anymore, right? Just like
I
I
am
can
looking
say what I
forward to that. I'm
want.
almost there, right? Well,
Uh,
and if nobody believes what I just said, think about situations in your life where you only know somebody through a very particular thing. So, like the teller at the bank, and then you see that teller at the bank in the supermarket, and you don't recognize them. You know them from somewhere, but you can't place them, right? And then you see them at the bank, and you're like, "Oh, I saw you at the supermarket the other day." You're like, it's just how our brains function, and when we start to understand how our brains work, that oftentimes it's spatially connected. A lot of neurodiversity is very similar to neurotypicalism, which is that we spatially locate our world. Then we can begin to hack that, but understanding then that we don't have to be who somebody assumes that we are, but we can be a similar person in all of these places. And I think that a lot of people get to that place. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, and that's the hope, right? That you can be so comfortable with your authentic self. And maybe it's not even a matter of discomfort. Maybe it's just you're playing that role because, you're with that group of friends or whatever. But that
absolutely. Yeah.
totally.
Well,
Uh,
and it's an interesting thing. I'm sorry, I know you've got another question, but I'll say this, right? People, like so many aspects of our culture, only allow certain aspects of us to come out. So I'm from Wales, and I'm learning Welsh. I never learned how to speak it properly, but I have a little bit of Welsh. People who are bilingual will often say to us that they have different personalities when they're speaking in different languages because of just how the brain is working when using those languages. And it's
that's
a
wild.
fascinating thing. It's really interesting. Yeah,
That's super wild. Yeah, wow, I love this conversation. And I know you do a lot of genealogy work too, and you kind of touched on it. I'd love to talk about that, like the story of our ancestors. How does that play into our identity?
absolutely. So I wrote this book, Ancestral Whispers, mainly as a way of spiritually connecting with ancestors. I'm part of a pagan metaphysical community, but a great deal of that also comes back to story. And I feel like what we often do with ancestors, we often do with family, particularly family and biological ancestors, is that we relegate them to who they were in the past. So who they were in life and the stories that we know about them is who they are eternally. But if you look at movies like Coco, for example, um, the wonderful Pixar movie, Pixar just
I haven't seen that one.
oh, it's lovely. I love it so much.
I'll have to see it. I love it.
Honestly, like Pixar, all the movies from Pixar, maybe not Toy Story, but all of the recent movies from Pixar are just like a psychology course in one, right? Like Inside Out is all about
I was just gonna say, I cannot watch that movie. That
no.
movie messed with me so bad. I was like angry and upset for like days after that. It was so upsetting to me. I don't know. It was just it was too much emotionally for me when that.
There's a lot packed into that, and same with Coco. There's a lot packed into that, right? It's one of those if people want to connect on a one-to-one basis, but what we're connecting with is story and all of the rules that have come down from those ancestors. And so, what ancestral work, from a kind of spiritual sense, is relating to the ancestors as we are now as human beings, one being dead, one being alive. Secondary to that, and very importantly, but secondary to that, is understanding what are the stories that we've been handed. This is coming back to our conversation about villains and heroes, right? Like, I know for a fact that one part of my family is going to see me as the black sheep of the family, right? I'm a villain in my family, well, my parents, but like in other parts of my family, because I'm gay, because I don't follow the course, because I'm living
Into
my own life,
metaphysics, all the things, yeah.
right? So the descendants of those people are going to see me, if they even are allowed to acknowledge that I exist at all, as being a villain or a black sheep, as all of that. And we think about families in that way, right? We think about communities and cultures in that way. Who are
Yeah.
the villains and who are the heroes? And why do they have those stories told about them? Because they fit a need, right? You know, um, and I feel like that often causes problems for people because of legacy pieces and whatnot. What ancestral work allows us to do is create our own relationships with these individuals on our own without the family telling us, right? And that comes back to, again, the tagline of ancestry.com and all of this of learn about your history, learn about who you are, right? Because there are aspects of those cultures that have come down to us. There's a wonderful tool that's used in therapy and social work and even like Christine counseling called a genogram. And what that is it's not just a genealogical tree, but it's tracking subpersonalities, addictions, story, and the rules all through down the generations.
Oh,
Subpersonalities often generate again and again and again. If you have a perfectionist mother, for example, who demands perfection from you, you'll become a perfectionist because you're afraid of what that would mean if you're not a perfectionist, right?
yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
And it makes me think of like, there's always like two sides to history too, right? Like there's or like wars. They say it's always the people who like won the war that are writing history. And I think about it too when you were saying like if there's some story passed on about some person way in your past, that's kind of how they're like stamped into history. And I think about that a lot when I watch historical fiction, where I'm like, when they bring characters to life, and it's like, wow, they were people like we were, like we
Yeah.
are. They lived a full life like I'm living. Like they had their problems, they had their joys, they had, all these complicated facets to their personalities. And we tend to forget that when we're just looking at them as like, this woman that lived in 1800 or whatever it is, right?
And again, that's very culturally based, right? The West is based on Christian culture, which says that ancestors and the dead have to be separate because they're dangerous otherwise, right? If you look at and I talk about this in this book, when you look at cultures where ancestor veneration is a spiritual practice and a way of living, it is normal to have an ancestral shrine in the corner where it's a regular chore for the kids to go and put offerings or light incense and say prayers to the heads of the family. That's a regular part of life. You've brought those stories in, you've brought those individuals in, right? They are related to every day. It isn't a, we're going to remember. And this is why ancestral work and mourning is very different. Mourning is about remembering the dead, but they're gone, they're away. And what do we do in society when somebody dies? We often feel uncomfortable even talking about them because we don't want to upset. Well, what we're actually doing is we're relegating those individuals to oblivion, right?
Yeah. And it makes me think about like in a few generations, you and I probably won't be remembered.
That's okay.
And it's
Yeah.
wild. It's just
It
so
freaks
crazy to
people
think
out
about.
though, doesn't it?
What's that?
It freaks people out though, doesn't it? Because that self-centeredness of, oh, I'm the hero. And if there's nobody's telling that story about me, then am I really the hero? Right?
Yeah, yeah, totally. And all those people in the past probably felt the same way about themselves too,
Mhm.
right? There's
Mhm.
still, I think I know I kind of just said this, but it's just it's so cool to think about that people who lived generations and generations and generations ago, like still were humans, right? They still had the same psychology we did. They still had that same hero complex. They had their own villains. Like it's just, yeah. And
And we don't tend to think of people like that. I was reading a study in the process of reading this that the modern human brain is actually 100,000 years old.
that's so
Now you
wild.
think how many billions of generations that is, that they were able to reason and logically think the same way. They had the same capacity to look at as we did, right?
Yeah.
And some things are truly universal. Like 6,000 years ago in ancient Babylonia, right, there were people who were writing to a company to complain because they, right? And that's one of
They
the
were
tablets.
trolls.
It's a complaint letter. Yeah, so and so gave me an oxen cart and it fell apart on me, and I'm really mad about it. That's really relatable, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's like uh, Amazon reviews or something. Um, okay, so when you're doing this genealogy work with people, like how do you I mean, are you trying to rewrite these stories? Are you trying to like breathe life into these people? Like how are you like what's the goal, I guess?
Well, it's different for different people, right? Part of it is uncovering those stories. How are they relating to those stories, right? Particularly with family, like individuals who are really dealing with issues of separating from family or the pressures of living their own life outside of family expectations. We often then will look at kind of the family patterns of, what's been happening. Why are you thinking about yourself this way? For other people, it might just be reconnecting with family, right? Sometimes people might find that they go through a period of their life where they reject family so much, and then they come to a phase in their life where they can actually relate to where their parents were, and that idea of empathy building. That idea of forgiveness work is really big in this. Now, forgiveness it's a dangerous word with some clients because it's so loaded. It has a lot of presuppositions with it about condoning behavior, when in reality it's about letting go. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Forgiveness is
Um,
always for you and not for the person.
sometimes, yeah,
So, okay. That's yeah, thank you for answering
you're
that.
welcome.
I wanna be like a fly on the wall in your sessions. Like, as you go through these
It's
stories.
a
I
lot
know
of
that's
like,
totally a HIPAA violation, but, it's just such fascinating work. Okay, so what about donor conceived children or adoptees? How do they navigate this, or where does this play in for them?
Absolutely. So again, this is a very culturally based paradigm, right? When you look at the majority of the way family is kind of constructed around the world, it's very different from the West sometimes, right? I was on a podcast a couple of weeks ago, or a month or so ago, and the host is partly from Jamaica. Her mum is from Jamaica, and so we were talking about that, like how many aunties and uncles does she have? Well, the whole parish is her family, right? When you look at the way that family is constructed and what's privileged, often in the West, it is the core family unit. And anything outside of that, then, oh, well, it doesn't mean anything. You
Mm,
go to other societies, and adoption is a huge part of society, right? Julius Caesar adopted Augustus. This really ties into those people who think about Roman Empire all the time. It's right. That
That
idea.
was a fun trend.
I love it. It's so funny, isn't it? Um, so I feel like with people who are adopted, family history. If you're looking at family, like if you're looking at history of self and like story of self, there's ways of then looking at self through that. Eventually, with genealogy, once you go back a few generations, eventually you'll have so many ancestors that they constitute an entire community. And we know that in certain parts of the world, if you go back 300 years, most families are stuck. They don't move. There is no social mobilization. So, a lot of people who have European heritage, for example, you can trace back 200, 300 years. Chances are your ancestors have been there for thousands of years, right? Biological ancestors. So eventually, the family story becomes the community story, becomes the region story, becomes the kingdom story. And so, for people who are adopted, if they know who their ancestors generally were, then that is their history, right? But it causes a lot of issues because, again, it's that over identification with story. Well, I'm adopted. I don't know who I am anymore. Well, you do know who you are because you were raised within the family and you've adopted the same culture that they've given you because you were socialized. But people don't think of it in that way because of how we construct and what we privilege, right? So a great deal of that is also to understand, well, how much are they putting emphasis on that family story? Is it like, what role is it playing for them in their life? So it really depends. There's a lot of pieces to it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for answering that. I understand that need for identity of connecting to all these parts of you, of your past. It makes sense, you know? I think if I was adopted or donor conceived, I would be searching for that too.
Again, it comes down to where we're at and what culture we come from. So much of us is really constructed, right? And I can speak from personal experience with this. I come from a blended family. My oldest sister, who's much, much older than me, was contacted one day by somebody she had never met in her entire life. And this person was 18 years old. And this person said, I'm your sister. And she wanted to have a relationship with my sister because of that perceived connection. My sister was like, I don't know who this person is. I don't know how. I don't know if I will even want a relationship because of the relationship she had with her dad, right? So it's one of those things. A lot of those societal rules that become really ingrained in us, that we then filter and take up because we think we have to in order to belong, right? A lot of pieces to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's all different complex personalities and
Yeah.
yeah, you can't assume that someone's gonna think the same way that you do either, right?
This is the thing. Yeah, this is the thing. And I don't think people really know until they're in the moment, right? You
Okay.
know. Mhm.
So, is there anything that we didn't touch on today that you think is really important to get across to listeners? From anything from the storytelling to the genealogy work at all? Yeah.
I would say, from a therapist perspective, it's all about coming home to self,
Mm,
right? And a lot, like the vast majority of work I do is literally just listening and creating space and asking the right questions so that the other person can really come home to self, right? Oftentimes we tell ourselves stories in order to feel better or because we feel we have to say those stories. And sometimes those become so subconscious, we're not even aware that they're a story. We actually believe them. So I feel like it's a great deal of my work, whether it be the spiritual piece, whether it be the therapy piece, whether it be even just the gaming piece, right? It's about how are you relating and in what capacity are you relating to the world around you, and how is that world relating to you, and what face are you putting forward, um, and empowerment.
yeah, I think that idea of coming home to self is such a beautiful one, and that's really kind of what this human experience is about, right? It's like we're born perfect and worthy and lovable and not broken in any kind of way, but then all this stuff gets placed on top of us, and then a lot of it is undoing all that, right? Like unlearning that, undoing that conditioning. And it's interesting. Like, I think most people do believe the stories they tell themselves,
Mhm.
right? Like that's how they make sense of the world, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely it is. It's the way that our brains are designed, is to believe those stories. But this is where the empowerment piece comes in, is that we get to control then what those stories are, right? A great deal of the unlearning oftentimes is being conscious of the stories, the operating systems, right? And because then we can actually decide, okay, well, this is the story that I want to live with, and put that forward and live through that story, right? This other story or this narrative that I was told I had to take on because it was my mum's story or my dad's story, my great aunt's story, or whoever's story, right? Isn't something that's working for me anymore. And so I get to change it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really empowering place. Or maybe it's a story I told myself when I needed that for protection, like an armor of some sort, and like maybe this doesn't serve me anymore.
Well,
And
and that's the other piece too, right? What are the stories that we tell about our own selves, right? A great deal of the issue that people find is that they often cringe about their former selves, right? I know I do. One of the most freeing things I ever learned was, um, if I can be proud, if in 10 years' time, the person I become can be proud of who I am now, maybe I can be proud of the person I was 10 years ago and have grace for myself. And that moment of being in between who I'm becoming and who I was is so huge, right?
yeah, that's a really beautiful thought because we're all just doing the best we can with
Exactly.
the tools we have. With we don't know what we don't know.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think the added benefit of that is that we then understand ourselves not just as singular beings, but as interconnected. If I can have grace for myself, maybe I can have grace for somebody else. Maybe I need to have grace and compassion for other people I can then bring that home and have compassion for self, right? Interrelated.
And that brings it full circle back to the things that trigger you about other people are unhealed aspects of yourself.
Yeah,
And and that we're really all connected, right?
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so many pieces. Yeah, there's so many pieces to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. Awesome. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so
This
much
was
for coming
wonderful.
on.
Yeah,
Um, Definitely, I feel like this hour flew by and I feel like could
yeah.
have kept going. I know it's crazy when they fly by like that. But yeah, thank you so much for the fascinating conversation. Please let listeners know where they can find your book, how they can
Mhm.
connect with you, any offers you have, all the things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I it's all on benstimpson.com, that hosts my podcast, that hosts my book, that hosts all my services. And you can also find all my social media on there. And I'll say a lot of my social media is pictures of my cat. So if people just want to see pictures of my cat, there she is.
I'm like waiting for her to run around in the
I
background.
know, she's like just over there. She's
Okay.
sleeping, I guess.
I love when pets like just enter the frame and just kind of meander by. It's always really cute. Well, thank you so much again. It was great having you. Listeners, if this resonated, please like, comment, share, subscribe, send it to someone you think would find it useful. I think we had a really amazing conversation today that a lot of people would find fascinating. So share it, spread the good word. Thank you all so much. Have a beautiful rest of your day. I'll see you next time.